Mark, great to be catching up with you again. It's very interesting. There's so many things happening in the automotive market at the moment. I think what will be great is if we just have a quick synopsis of exactly what is happening and how quickly things are changing.
With 30 years' experience in auto logistics and state-of-the-art locations in 5 major Australian cities, Precar Fleet Services are a premier all-in-one solutions provider for commercial vehicle fleet operators, leasing companies and original equipment manufacturers. Please visit precar.com.au and click on the link to Fleet Services.
Yes, John, there's never a dull moment in the auto industry. There's a lot of it. It's funny. You look at the interest rate moves, you look at supply, demand, you look at the broader economy, the retail sector, you look at the pain, the rental market, the housing crisis, etc. There's a lot of pain in the Australian public right now. But certain sectors are doing okay. And the surprising one is the auto industry, which is sort of bucking the trend from everything else. But it really comes down to the reasons why we need cars. And we kind of we get caught up in the how many, EV this and cylinders that and fuel type this and SUV here and hybrid there. It really comes down to why do we drive cars? And why do we drive cars is for mobility. And it's interesting when you look at pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, and the shock that the pandemic caused. But the shock the pandemic caused wasn't just that car dealers were closed and suddenly they were open and then suddenly they didn't have stock and then prices went up. There's been a whole thing about migration. There's been a whole thing about households. And if you look at mobility, it's all about how we get around. Now, okay, overseas flights are back and everyone's going on overseas holidays, but ultimately you still need mobility to move around. But those overseas holidays are a double-edged sword because what we've got now is we've got immigration. And if you look at the numbers just into Australia since the pandemic, you're looking at close to 1 million people by the end of this year will have arrived once the borders have been opened again. So we've had this net increase in migration. There's been a bit of organic population growth, but we know that babies that are born don't drive cars. But what we do know is that when students and other migrants come to this country, they need a car. So some of them buy new cars. A lot of them, in fact, most of them, will probably buy a used car. And that's where you see there's a bit of support in the used car market. But also there's this need for cars to top up. So when we look at this, the talk of a 1.2 million car market, that is just doesn't make sense if you think if the population was at its levelest. 1.1 million is the running rate for the Australian auto industry up until the pandemic. Pandemic dropped, so we dropped under 1 million. So then we had to play catch up. But we caught up for the local demand. But what we haven't really looked at is, okay, there's actually more people now coming in. And what the other big thing that's happened is the car park, which is the physical cars on the Australian roads, that number has increased. So just before the pandemic, so January 2020, the total overall car park was just under 20 million cars. It was 19.8. This year, the auto census for the actual car park is 21.2 million vehicles. They're cars, trucks, etc. So 21.2 million. Just think about that. So pretty much in 3 years, the number of vehicles has gone up by over 1 million. Now, that's 1 million new cars absorbed in 1 year going in and nothing coming off the road. So a couple other things are happening there. So you've got these people coming in, buying cars. They're buying new and used. We've got a hole in the used car market because there weren't a lot of cars sold in 2020. Now, those cars would normally be 3-year-old cars coming to market, ex-lease cars and this sort of stuff coming back into the market now. But there's actually a low number of those 2020 used cars. So those prices are going to still be quite high. There's lots of 2017 cars because that was a big year for volume. But what we're also seeing now is you've got interest rates kicking in. So that makes it hard to finance. You've got payments that you have to make for your house, etc. And that means you're going to change the sort of vehicles that you buy. Supply's back, so you can get a car, which is not a problem. But the challenge you've got now, it's a bit like the housing crisis. Those extra people coming in, it also meant that they've absorbed all the spare capacity for rental properties or houses to buy. So You still need mobility. You still need somewhere to live. Increased migration means a bigger car park, which means those cars are being purchased, but they're still not the turnover, which means the prices are still holding up quite firmly. A very unique situation indeed, John.
Yeah, Mark, what's the average age of a car now in Australia? Where do you see that? Have cars got older, or are they still the same age?
It's a very good point. So if we go back to, once again, the good old days of January 2020, the average age of the car park was 10.4 years. Now, when we look at the average age of the car park here in 2023, in January, it's 11.3 years. So it's already moved up by 1 year, which is incredible. So you got physically a lot more cars on the road, an extra million, and they're older by at least another year. And that really goes to that point that we talked about, that all those 2017 cars, the 2016, 15, 14, 13 cars, a lot of them are still well and truly on the road, not getting written off or all this sort of stuff. So the car park is continuing to be maintained and grow. So those older cars are being driven a lot more. The other interesting stat is when you look at the car park, we talked about EVs and the adoption of EVs, and this has been a big year for Australia catching up with EVs, etc. But there's only 79,700 registered battery EV vehicles out there on Australian roads. And yet there's 362,000 hybrids. So EVs still have a long way to go. So if you think we've got 21 million cars and yet only 79,000 of them currently are EVs, yes, the new ones coming in are going to increase that turnover. But when you look at that car park of 11.3 year average, it's going to take a long time before petrol stations disappear, and a long time before we have massive charging infrastructure that's going to take over all of that too. So there's still a long journey to go with EVs, but encouragingly, they're getting adopted a lot faster there than they were way back in 2017 and 2018.
Mark, I think what's really interesting for me is that if the average age of a car is now gone from 10 to 11, just over 11 years, which you mentioned, that means the very old cars that are still being driven around are now into 22, 23 years old, whereas normally they would have been taken off the road when they're 20. So there's two things what's interesting for me. Who's driving those very older cars and why they're being sold? I think the second point is, with such old cars, it's going to create more danger on the road because those cars don't have the latest technology that a new car will have in terms of braking ability, in terms of airbags, safety features and all that. And the third point is going to be a very good business for dealers, because when you got all these older cars being driven around, any automotive dealer that's in that market for repairing cars, they're going to be selling a lot more parts and labor, because once a car gets to 20 years old, there's going to be start to see a lot of major failure of big components in the car. So it's going to be mean very good business for both OEMs and dealers going forward. What's your perspective on that?
So I actually have a different view to you, John. It's actually great news for the aftermarket. The OEMs lose interest in the car park after 5 years. And often that's usually where most after sales directors live, in the what's my 5-year car park, and after that the customers have left and they're in the aftermarket. So when you look at that midpoint of the average age being 11.4 years now, 11.3 years, you are looking at a very strong aftermarket service network, and that's where the parts and service will be really very robust, because those cars are being maintained a lot longer. It's interesting the point you make about safety. Yes, they're not as the safety specs in the cars are not the same as what a brand new car right now is. But we shouldn't forget that a car that is 20 years old, so 20 years ago it was 2003. There were 5-star cars around in 2003 with airbags, ABS, EBD, track stability control. There was a lot of technology in those cars that were significantly safer than, say, my beautiful 1968 Camaro, where the only safety device on that was a collapsible steering column, so it didn't stab you in the heart when you had a head-on. So the cars are a lot safer than, say, 20 years earlier. They're not as amazing as the current ones, but they still have a lot. There's still a fair bit of safety in those vehicles, but not exactly the same as these. The issue you've got is their fuel consumption and their green rating was nowhere near as good as the current ones, but it comes down to cost. And this is why you look at some of if you looking at a car in that price point, those 20-year-old cars are still hovering around $5,000. They sort of get to this point where they hit this $5,000 level, and they don't seem to drop below it. That seems to be the point where you can get a clunker for $5,000. You'll probably need to spend a few hundred on to get it onto the road, or maybe $1,000. But they just keep going and keep going and keep going. Whereas if you go back earlier days, you were doing engine rebuilds on a car that was 10 years old, whereas now you're not. So there's improvements, and this is where the ICE cars have well and truly improved over the journey. The technology is mature, and they're fairly reliable, and you'll get some good use out of them. And that's why they still make good sense for someone, first cars for people, students, these people who just arrived in the country that maybe are lower social economic. They can afford to get those cars. They can still get good use out of it.
The other aspect of it is you're going to have more vehicles on the road. So there's going to be more chance of having an accident. So it's going to be also positive for insurance companies and repair shops.
It's definitely great news for insurance companies. The bigger the car park, the more policies you have. So it is great news. It's great news for, as I said, the aftermarket's fantastic, but it's still at the pointing, and it means that you can still have a 1.1 or 1.2 million car market that still is robust, because there is an appetite for the used cars that those people who are buying a new car are either, most of them are trading in a car or getting rid of a car in some way, shape or form, or handing it down to a family member. So this is where there's still an appetite for the new cars to continue. Maintaining that population growth is great news for more new sales. And that's the staggering number, is that extra, just that the migration, but more so than just natural birth rates. Migration's the key because, as I said before, babies don't drive cars. It's getting people who are over 25 who are coming to this country that are going to buy a car. It's been an interesting discussion, John. Now, I'm keen to put it to our listeners as to what their thoughts are. Population growth, everyone needs a car, mobility, housing, roads, and charging infrastructure if you've got an EV. Is it moving fast enough? Does it match the population growth? Will it match the growth in the EV car park? Because not so much EV sales, it's the EV car park that makes the difference. We invite you to put your comments below. It'd be great to get your thoughts.